Hello everyone. Welcome to our new webinar in the new season, and today we're going to talk about influencers. We have two long-time IABCers here, and my name is Jasna Suchadols. I'm one of the board members at IABC EMENA, and I will be your host today. So our two long-time IABCers are Michael Nord and Mike Klein. Hello.
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 So before I present them, let me just mention, you see on the slide that we still have a few hours left for our IABC member month, which gives you, if you join IABC or reinstate your membership during the last few hours that you have left, we will give you 10% off of international dues. But there are also some very nice Ticketmaster gifts and things like that you can check at rocket.iabc.com. So first I will present Michael Nord. Michael Nord is now a director of IABC, and he's been actively involved in the European operations of IABC for more than a decade, which is, I think, how I met you, and I met you about 9 years ago, so in the beginnings. He is also a principal consultant with the Fifth Business in the Netherlands, and advises and coaches leaders in large organizations on how to manage their stakeholders using appropriate tools and methods. He speaks 5 languages, and was born in Denmark and lives in the Netherlands, and he's been a presenter, a speaker at our webinars before. So thank you for coming back, Michael. And he's joined by Mike Klein, who is currently regional vice chair of the IABC EMENA. We serve on the same board, and he is internal communications consultant and a writer. You probably know, or if you don't, you need to check out his blog, Changing the Terms. And he also runs a business with the same name that supports organizations in identifying influencers and driving strategic messages. So thank you for coming, and I will now give you, Mike, the presenter view so we can start your webinar.
Thank you very much for that, Jasna, and a little bit more about the two of us on the screen. One point worth mentioning about my background is prior to going into corporate internal communication, I used to manage political campaigns in the United States for 8 years. And that was actually how I got to make the connection between the role of influencers generally and the role of influencers inside corporations of their large organizations. That ended up being the basis of a book that I wrote called From Lincoln to LinkedIn, the 55-Minute Guide to Social Communication. Michael.
Thank you, Mike. Michael Nord. I'm principal with the Fifth Business, and welcome to this webinar. I'm very pleased that so many are joining on this last day of October. And we're going to talk today about influencers in internal communications and where they fit in the picture of change and internal comms. I've been working in internal comms for more than 10 years, helping large organizations drive change, but also ensure that employees are engaged, are up to speed on where the strategic direction is, and what the expected behavior is. We are, as internal communicators, driving our value by supporting and explaining this direction. But I also see that our role is changing. We used to be what some people refer to the SOS, the people who send out stuff, whether it's a newsletter, whether it's posting on an intranet, or whether it's creating webinars like this internally. And our role is changing to be more involved in the engagement area. And one of the areas that I'm seeing is that a lot of change projects and transformation projects are taking place in large organizations as we speak, but a number of them are failing. And they're failing because they fail to embed, they fail to anchor themselves within the organizations, because the organization failed to identify who in the organization could actually help. There's no doubt that our goal is to win the hearts and minds. We need to change attitudes and thereby change behaviors. We can only do this in today's complex organizations if we identify influencers who can help have the conversations that we, as internal communications people, and the leaders and managers we support cannot have. And that's why this idea of being able to identify influencers is something that's very close to my heart, and that I've been working with Mike Klein and some of his compadres around the world on for the last year or two.
Thank you, Michael. Just so that you know, if you have any questions, because everybody's on mute, if you go to the chat box and send your question to our host, Jasna, we will make sure that within the allotted time we will answer or at least address your question. Now, it's worth looking at the question, what is the answer? And it's a crucial question because we all have ideas of what an influencer is, and particularly communicators have an idea and management has an idea, and they're not necessarily the same idea. So let me share with you what I mean when I use the term influencer inside of an organization. The most important thing is that an influencer is an informal leader, that his or her importance is derived from something other than their positional status in the organization. It doesn't mean that a senior manager or a senior leader is not influential. It's just that their influence is derived from something more along the lines of the relationships they build outside of their own fiefdom in the organization as it is from their position on the org chart. And the second thing about an informal leader is that their role as a leader involves the sharing of support and information, that they're actually enabling other people in the organization to do what they need to do, and ideally to do what they need to do better. An additional piece of what an influencer is that an influencer is somebody who can exist at any level of an organization. They exist throughout organizations, geographically as well as hierarchically, and they tend to have two particular types of roles. One is a connective role. PAs, people who work on and integrate cross-functional teams, sometimes even the people who work in the mailroom have collected a lot of relationships and agitate a number of relationships over time. The second type of employee who can be an influencer is somebody who is knowledge rich and shares their knowledge. So we're talking about the people who know everybody and the people who know everything, or at least everything about a specific topic. There's also some demographics that are worth looking at. Some influencers, research shows, are people who've moved around the company. So they've moved from location to location, function to function, and have retained a large number of relationships from those various moves. Others have been in central positions in the same place and just seen a lot of people come and go in the organization. And a small but very important number are newcomers. And there's a wonderful case that my friend Jeppe Hansgaard, who's the CEO of Incentivize, the market leader in the organizational network space, he identified a case called the Frenchman, which was literally a new French employee who came into a Danish oil company and proceeded to get to know the organization very well, meeting people, seeking out meetings, seeking out conversations, standing by the water cooler, asking a lot of questions. And when they did a social map of the company, he was like the third most influential, even though he was French and had only been there for a number of months. So Michael will tell us about what isn't an influencer.
Exactly, because if you speak to your leaders or your managers in organizations, you will say, or you will hear, yeah, but we have an informal network. We have our ambassadors. An ambassador is not an influencer, because an ambassador is appointed by leadership and often seen by the people as on the management side and someone who may not be able to listen to everyone in the organization, or at least not out in the corners of the organization where we really want to listen to. And why is that? It's because it takes time to build the trust. And just because you're appointed as an ambassador for a change project or a transformation project doesn't necessarily mean you have the trust of the people. You may have trust of leadership or management, but you may not have the trust. And this is why what I mentioned before, that some change and transformation projects actually fail, because they appoint ambassadors or change agents, but these people may know the topic, they may know the methodology, they may know what's expected, and they may have a small network, but they may not have the right network, and they may not be able to identify the right people in the right network. And that is why we're seeing that top-down doesn't always work for change and transformation. If you really want to embed cultural change, you need bottom-up.
And so this leads us to the question of why do the influencer research inside the company? Because ultimately, simply choosing a bunch of well-intentioned, and a lot of the ambassadors and change agents that I've worked with over the years are extremely well-intentioned and friendly and positive people, but they just don't necessarily have the roadmap through which to actually have conversations with the right people to get the right feedback. But to do the influencer research is something that will give you access to the right 3% of employees, the top influencers, the key influencers, who actually connect with and represent the remaining 90% of employees. There's actually a rule called the 390 rule, which has proven true in nearly all the organizations in which organizational network analysis has been tested. And the role of these 3% of the employees is to drive sense-making, put things into context, share key information, and also, where feedback is sought, to provide, honest insights back to leadership. And this has to happen before change happens. Otherwise, you can change the name of something, you can change a process, but people keep doing things the old way until things break down or until people leave the organization. And the nice thing about influencers is because they're such a small part of the organization, and by the time you've done the research, you actually have all their names and email addresses on the list, that it becomes a very quick way to accelerate sense-making in corporate or other large organizational environments. And so, looking at the 390 rule, the key thing about the 390, the simple principle of the 390 rule, is that people who are good at giving support and sharing information tend to do it for a fair number of people. They tend to be popular, and that's and that's why they tend to generate such large and wide impact networks.
Absolutely, and I think why this really works is that we ask people who they collaborate with, who they go to for support, and that is always that is already an indication of trust. We also see it when organizations want to do crowdsourcing or crowdfunding. We see it works in social circles, so why not use them internally? I see some organizations starting to use crowdsourcing, and it actually works. But again, when we do it, we quite often see that it's the influencers who drive this kind of activity.
And speaking of rules, I want to share a set of rules for winning political campaigns. This is something that I learned early in my political career back in the U.S., that Abraham Lincoln, before he became president, about 25 years before he became president, set out a number of rules for winning political campaigns that were improved on. The first is make a perfect list of the voters. The second is determine with certainty who those voters will support. Number 3, to persuade the undecided, send in someone whom they trust to persuade them. And number 4 is turn out the good voters on election day. Now, number 3 is the most important in general from a corporate communications perspective, and it's absolutely crucial from an influencer perspective. Because what corporations tend to do is rather than identify individuals who are credible to the audience or to the key people who need to make things happen, they tend to give messaging responsibility to people the organization trusts, the CEOs, line managers, or other senior people who have a lot of credibility in the boardroom, but don't necessarily have it in the open plan office. And so the key thing about influence is not to ask people who they trust, either as sources of knowledge or as sources of support. And trust is the common denominator because, particularly in the high-pressure world of corporate life, you need to ask people that you can rely on for crucial information that allows you to make decisions without making mistakes that you can get called out on. So what influencer research does is it identifies who the people are who are sought out at the water cooler, so that we can get a map or at least a sense of where do they go to make sense of what happens in organizations. And ironically, even though organizations tend to be very cautious about this internally, sometimes legal raises a stink, sometimes privacy issues come up, and managers get really upset that their relative power compared to where it sits on the org chart may be exposed. The fact is, this is something that organizations are doing externally on a much more consistent and rapid basis. It's permeating market research, social media influencers. Everybody's talking about social media influencers. Well, this type of research is what you do to find out who social media influencers are. And so how do you do this?
So you need to ask people, so the people in the organization, who is it that they go to for knowledge? So who do they ask for how to use a certain IT systems, or how to follow a certain procedure, how to do a certain safety, but also who do they go to for support when they have something that they're not quite sure, or where they simply need a second pair of eyes. Who are these people? And this is where the trust comes in. If we can we can identify the people that they go to for trust and have trust in, then we come a far way. And there are two main methodologies which Mike will explain.
Yes, there are two very different ways of achieving similar but not the same outcomes. My preferred approach, which I've worked with a company called Incentivize that I've mentioned. There are a number of other companies in this field called organizational network analysis or social mapping. And the key thing about organizational network analysis is that it's deeply comprehensive. It tends to involve all employees or all employees who can be willing to participate. And some of the participation rates get into the 70, 80, 90% levels. And what this does is a comprehensive map of patterns and connections throughout the organizations. So it looks like, an airline route map at the end of the day, where you've got 5 or 10% of the dots of the hubs, which are called hubs, connect everything else, and they're all interconnected together to a large extent. And there's a lot of material and there's a lot of work that's being done in organizational network analysis that's even making it more relevant and more exciting for corporations. The other approach, which is actually something I'm doing at the moment for a building products company, is looking at snowball sampling. And snowball sampling, there's an article from McKinsey about it as well. I recommend it if you want to go into this space. It involves identifying no more than, say, 10% of the employees and asking them these two questions to keep them engaged with the survey rather than just suspicious about the request. But the two basic questions: who do you go to for knowledge, and who to go for support? I actually usually ask for about 3 people on each of those. And what happens is the respondents come back with names. And then the names which are mentioned most frequently, you do the survey with again. And you keep doing the survey with those people who are mentioned most frequently until no more names keep surfacing. So it's a fairly basic, it's not, you know, it's fairly labor intensive, but it's a fairly basic way of getting a reliable list of influencers throughout the organization. And while you get a map through organizational network analysis, you get a list through snowball sampling. And you can then provide this list or use this list to either create a network that you actively involve yourself with, a network of influencers, or perhaps even integrate the network of influencers with the network of ambassadors. How do you not do this?
Yeah, so quite often you would go to your manager and ask for names. So they would be names that your manager or your team lead or whoever you ask knows and believes and probably right that they have influence in the organization. Some people would even go to HR because HR should know. And some people may come to you and say, can you help me identify? And actually, when you do that, again, you are back in the ambassador or champion approach, and that is not the same as the influencers. There are even some organizations who use email patterns, so that you use technology to identify who speaks to who. But again, that may not be the right approach, and actually becomes very complex in large organizations. So
it also becomes very transactional.
Exactly.
Email is a much more transactional way of communicating than asking people for help. And when you map out or collect a list of the people that people ask for help, you have a list that reflects trust as well as transaction.
Okay,
Yes,
if I may interrupt you, yeah, we have two questions. One was from Maya Townsend, and she asked for a citation for the 390 rule, if you have it or if you can provide it. Innovizer
has written a lot on the 390 rule. It's www.innovizer.com.
Okay, great. And Duke Swain, I hope I pronounced this correctly, asked if you use organizational network analysis, how do you ensure that the people will trust that this is not something that people will be misused by the management? How do you sell the survey to employees?
Good question. Thank you, Duke. I've recently done this for 2 organizations, and it's very important that you have your whole communications plan ready. You need to tell employees what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what you intend to do with the results. So not only communicating to the influencers once they're identified, but communicating to the whole organization why you're doing it, what you're doing, and what you're going to do with the results, or how you're going to use the influencers. That is key. You don't necessarily need to expose the influencers once they are identified, because you don't want them to be inundated with requests from everyone. But you do want to give the influencers the names to the people who either communicate or who engage with staff or who are leading the change project you are working with. It's important also to say thank you once the survey is closed. Thank you very much. We will not reach out to the influencers. Thank you for what you've done. And you also need to think of data privacy, as we mentioned before. Certain countries, and certainly the EU countries coming from 1st of January, will have new data privacy laws. And it's important that you work with legal and HR to ensure that you have everything right. And also, another piece of advice, if you're working with an external partner, you need to work with IT, because you need to have the server where the survey sits whitelisted from IT, so that the people who receive the email don't get a phishing email. That actually happened in one case in one of the 2 situations I was involved. So we had to ensure that IT whitelist the server where the email comes from.
And one other thing to add is, when you come up with the survey, I recommend that you ask a small number of relevant additional questions, like about the current climate or the current change agenda, so that the respondent isn't completely focused on the request for the names, but sees it as part of a larger context of helping improve and accelerate the change situation.
Absolutely. This is your chance also, if it's not at the time of year where your company is doing the annual survey, this is your chance also to take the temperature of the organization. So as Mike said, just ask a few simple questions, maybe ask for keywords. How do you feel right now? So yes.
Okay, Susan and Andrew are both asking if you can spell again the 390 source, Mike.
I just sent it to you.
Okay, thank you. I will use it in the chat box. So it's innovisor.com with two N's, INNOVISOR.com.
Correct.
I will send everybody to the chat.
Thank you. All right, moving on. So the two cases that I just mentioned, one of them is one I'm going to use here today. The company is a global energy player, so with activities around the world, a very large company, and the internal IT organization, which also works across the globe, wanted to create a cultural change. And they were looking to us to see how can we identify the right people to help us embed the change. The IT organization in this global company is very complex. There is a global organization, there are the matrix organization, there are segments, national organizations, and they do a number of different things, as you can imagine, from a large IT organization. We ran out the survey. It took a week to get the right amount of percentage we wanted to ensure we had the right sampling. And the people in the organization, which was a global organization of 1,700 people, identified 50 people. So again, if you look at the 390 rule, you would see that that fits here. One of the questions we asked also was about collaboration. And it was very interesting and also surprising and maybe a little shocking for the IT leadership to see that there was very little collaboration across segments. There was collaboration taking place from the segments to the global organizations, but among the segments themselves, or among the countries or regions, there was very little collaboration. And we advised the IT organization to help identify some cross-segment collaboration projects and use some of the 50 influencers that we identified to see if they could help embed some cross-segment collaboration. That would be a proof of whether it works or not. The cultural change will be the next step. So once they roll out the change, these 50 influencers will be part of co-creating content, co-creating communication, but also be the listening device, the voice of the people, so to speak, to the organization and to the internal communications team. Over to you, Mike.
All right. I'm mentioning a couple projects here. One I was involved with a couple of years ago involving an international mobile operator, so a company that had mobile networks in a number of countries in Europe, North Africa, and Asia. And the original idea was to do a full-blown social map of the organization, but legal wouldn't allow us to reveal individual connections with participant names, and really didn't want us to reveal participant names to many people in all but a few countries. And so partially this was because we were dealing with 15 different sets of data privacy laws. But nevertheless, we were able to get lists of influencers for country-level programs. We were able to give the country list back to the countries which they could use. And the country that made use of this was Pakistan, which was going through a national program where all mobile phone SIM holders had to revalidate their SIMs with a thumbprint. And so Pakistan was one of the countries we surveyed. And even though we only had people who were registrants to our group intranet, so we had about maybe 3,000 people eligible out of about 7,500 in the organization. We were able to get a good group of about 200 recognized and credible informal leaders. We actually went above the 3% threshold because the magnitude of the program was so huge. And these leaders are effectively approached to become ambassadors for the internal mobilization effort for this program. They were things about the case for it and about how the organization was going to move forward. And then these people, as leaders, as informal leaders, drove the bulk of the colleague engagement to get people to drive through their own social networks, through their work, and even through work outside of normal circumstances to drive participation in the revalidation program. The key thing was that those customers who didn't revalidate lost their SIM cards had to be shut down. And the net result was that our Pakistan operation had a 1% increase in market share, which in a country with at least 70 million mobile phone users, that's a very significant amount of subscribers who were saved by, in part, the employee engagement driven by these influencers who became ambassadors for the purpose of this program. The project I'm working on now in this area is with a global building material company. And it's actually the first time that I've directly used the snowball method, although I've seen it used elsewhere. And the rationale for that was that they wanted to reach offline employees as well as online employees, and to at least get viable lists of offline influencers, and to reach across levels and geographies efficiently as well as effectively. And the main goal of this program is to take an existing ambassadors program where the management selected its ambassadors, not really having a grasp of the distinction between ambassadorship and influence, and realizing that having access to the real influencers can not only provide needed feedback and support for the current change program, but actually help the ambassadors develop as influencers by becoming ambassadors in the network and learning from those who've been able to develop the trust and respect that influencers have. To close, Michael?
Thank you. Just needed to unmute. So there's no doubt, as you can have heard that, and you probably realize from your own organizations, that internal influencers are underutilized. We can use them for internal communications, and we can use them for change and transformation. It takes some effort, it takes some rigor to identify and mobilize them, but there are methodologies and there are people and organizations who have experience doing this, and a lot of them are actually sharing on LinkedIn what they're doing, because we're seeing this as the next big step in internal communications. There are lots of benefits, and some of them we've listed here. It lends credibility, it adds authenticity, it adds velocity, and it certainly adds your reach into the organization. And it also makes it a little bit easier. If you can use 3% to reach 90% of the organization, I think you will find your work and your job a little easier.
Any questions?
Yes, thank you, Michael and Mike. We have two questions that haven't been answered yet. One is from Sylvia Cambier, and she asks, how do you keep up the relationship with influencers when the transformation project is over? You might need them again in the future for another projects, and it is important to keep up the relationship over time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you for attending today. No doubt you can use Yammer or you can use other social groups. You need to make them feel special. You need to ensure that they feel engaged and are informed, but also that they are not overused by everyone in the organization. That's why I said before, do not disclose to everyone in the organization who they are, because then they will be abused by everyone. They are your tool, yours and management and the change teams. Ensure they are informed beforehand, before you do stuff, but also use them creatively. So you can use them for co-creating content. You can listen to them before you start sending out, and you can even tell them this will be the date we send out. So maybe it's now the time to start having those water cooler or coffee conversations. But social networks like Yammer internally is definitely a way of keeping them engaged. And maybe you want to link them to each other because maybe they have best practices or methodologies they can share with each other and learn to be better networkers and influencers in the organization.
To add to that, a couple of things. One is, in addition to nurturing your current set of influencers, it's also very useful to do this type of research, and ideally to do the same type of research at least once a year when there is an environment of activity and change and perhaps even upheaval, because some influencers leave, some people increase their level of influence and they need to be on your radar screen, and some people, once they've been identified, become less effective as influencers. It's not a fatal side effect, but it's something that we have to look into. A lot of the effectiveness of influence is in its unconscious application. And conversely, some people, when they know they're influencers, take their game up another notch or two. So we're taking that area. But the key thing is influence is not a fixed picture.
Okay, thank you. Felicia Hsu is asking, is the McKinsey article you referenced tapping the power of hidden influencers from McKinsey quarterly in March 2014?
That's the one.
Okay, that's great. And then Susan Petzina is asking, there are two ways in which I have successfully used influencers over the years. The first is provide them with the formal communication materials and ask to use. And the second is provide only key messages and regular peeps into the kitchen. Which would you recommend and why?
Can I take this first?
Yeah, do that, Mike.
It depends on, in my view, influencer, I believe in two-tier internal communication, or twin streaming it, where you've got a mass awareness stream where people know are engaged in what's going on. But then there's a preferred stream that goes to managers, leaders, and ideally influencers that puts what's happening into a why context, a how context, a when context, what have you. And so my normal preference is to upgrade their information flow to that which management is getting, at least as much as confidentiality issues would allow. But that's not the case in every initiative. If it's a safety initiative, deluging these people with financial information makes no sense. And what you may want to do is give them just added emphasis points so that they can role model stuff that other people will notice being role model. The main thing is you need a separate stream, because if you're just giving your influencers the same information you're giving anyone else, you're not creating any reason for information to flow in one direction or another.
I would add to that. Thank you, Susan, for your question. I think, and for your sharing your best practices. I would add that depends on the situation, but you may also want to ask and seek the influences on what is the preferred way of communicating to staff in the area where you are. What do you see working and not working? I mean, we may have the data on click-throughs and openings, and we may get our pulse feedback, but we may not know what works in daily life. How do you best get the message across, whether it's a safety message, it's a change message, it's a IT message, whatever it is, and what works in the areas where people, the influencers are. So you can use them as that sounding board as well.
Okay, thank you. Chaya Mystery is asking, in the examples you used, what was the urgency burning platform?
In In the mobile case, it was really more of an integrative an attempt at an integrative exercise. You had 14 different companies in 14 different countries, and trying to figure out who would be key to creating an integrated group across this whole business, kind of to unite the business at more than just a top of the table. The issues that we had with legal made it very difficult to do that, but it gave us a tool to give the operating company something that they would have never figured out on their own, a window into the most influential people within their own individual organizations. And this is a group which had been doing a lot with ambassadors programs, getting some results, but not really getting systemic results. And so that was a secondary value add, but it was a very welcome value add to these organizations. On the second project, it's really more that, you know, there's a change that needs velocity, and being able to do it, trying to force it through ambassadors who don't have a lot of traction isn't working for these folks.
Thank you, Mike. In my case, working with the global IT organization, it was to be ready for change. So the change, working the change plan, working the comms plan, working the details, and using the influencers' input into this. So help them co-create how we're going to roll it out, when we're going to roll it out, and what tools and methods works best in their parts of the organization.
Okay, thank you. Andrew Morrison is asking, what are the best way to encourage or incentivize the influencers to participate? And what happens if you're in a huge multinational? Because even 3% of 100,000 is 3,000 influencers.
That's absolutely correct. Thank you, Andrew, and hello. There's no doubt that the larger your organization is, the more difficult and more challenging it becomes, but also, from my perspective, more interesting. I think you need to break it down. I think you need to break it down in segments or regions or groups. The pilot I've been involved in, actually, we realized that we only had the names within that segment, and that didn't allow for people to point to people outside their own function or segment. And I actually said it would have been more interesting if that would have been allowed, because then we could have seen whether IT people speak to finance people or HR people or people in the business, but that wasn't possible. I think you're right. It is complex if you have an organization of 50,000 or 100,000, and then suddenly you have 1,500 or 3,000 influencers. But I think you need to break them down. I think it's rare that you have situations where comms is communicating to everyone at the same time, unless it's a group strategy or global change, and even then we still break it down into two segments and regions and functions. But it would be interesting to see a project that is that big and to see how you would go about managing your influencers.
Conversely, influencers are always participating, which is why they're influencers. Influencers are the participants, you know, the active, proactive, voluntary participants in the organization. Whether they're going to participate in an initiative or in supporting an initiative at management's request is another matter. Sometimes you want to make the request. Sometimes you want to go out in the open and establish a relationship. Other times you may just simply want to sit and watch, you know, until it becomes necessary to engage a particular influencer versus another particular influencer. I mean, it really depends on the dynamics which you're monitoring the progress of the change in the parts of the organization where that influencer has influence. It may be worth doing further research to find out if the influencer is positively negatively or indifferently inclined towards what's going on, because at that point, you can arrange conversations. It's not crazy to have a reluctant influencer who drives conversations with 1,500 people, get an audience with a C-level person to put things into context. It's not crazy to establish relationships between extremely important influencers and other extremely important people in the organization so that they become part of the process. But it's really a function of what the change is, what the dynamics are, and where the influencers' heads are.
I second that. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Maya is asking, how do you handle issues of consent? Are influencers asked when they're willing to be named as influencers? Whether they're willing to be named?
Yes, absolutely. You need to have their buy-in. I mean, influencers can be people who are busy already and who will say, actually, I don't want more on my plate. I'm happy as I am. I'll go on doing what I do. You may try to persuade them and convince them by using others to influence the influencers, but actually, you do need consent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Mike, did you want to add something?
Well, I think part of it is that, and this is actually where we got a little bit hung up with the legal stuff at the mobile company, is that there was some issue about whether somebody could nominate as an influencer and nominate somebody who they work with or not. To answer, put their name in the answer, versus having consent for influencers to be revealed to the rest of the organization. There's actually a number of consent issues, and those are really driven by, as much as anything, local privacy law. To be fair, I've never seen a situation where people weren't allowed to give names of influencers, but whether those names could be revealed is a big issue.
Yeah.
Okay. Kristen Detours is asking, how do you get the 3% influencers briefed and aligned if you don't have internal social media and if they're not in the same physical location?
That's a really good question, Christian. Thank you for asking. You don't need enterprise social networks for this. This approach existed and was successful long before ESN came on the scene. Email addresses, conference calls. So long as you have a list of your employees, or at least a list of your employees who are affected by the change. I mean, it comes down to Lincoln's first rule: make a perfect list of the voters. So long as the influencers are on the list, then you can communicate with them. Now, having a platform and an influencers list can be an extremely valuable conversation. It can help revive an enterprise social network very quickly, because having this group and having the platform creates a rationale for both to exist and to sustain themselves as communities. But an ESN is by no means a necessary condition.
No, I think you're absolutely right. If you don't have this, this is a chance to do it. This is a chance to set up, and there are a number of tools out there. I wouldn't advise, though, to have a WhatsApp group of a few hundred people, but there are other tools you can use. That's free and that's available.
Okay, thank you. Joe Moffat mentioned, I was just going to ask, and you began to answer, Mike. Does the influencer have to remain covert? Once they're outed, do they lose credibility, or is there a way to prevent this?
As the economists would say, it depends. It depends on both the organization and the nature of the influence role that the influencer has. I don't like to out influencers as a general rule, But actually, it was fairly successful in Pakistan. They asked people if they wanted to be effectively ambassadors, and they became ambassadors, and they did a great job. But also there's a kind of collective can-do spirit in that Pakistan business that you might not see in other businesses.
Okay, Daryl Mead is asking, in your experience, is it most important to influence the whole executive team about this new approach, or are there specific functions who are driving the most change in organizations?
I think it depends on the company, but we didn't inform the executive team, we informed the leadership team of that specific function. So the leadership team was involved. They saw the communication before it went out. They also prepared their senior leaders to what was coming in order to encourage people to take part in the survey and to help explain. So we get together with the vendor, we created a number of FAQs so that both the leadership team, management team, and the communications team were prepared to answer those questions. And then the email went out with a link to privacy and with a link to the FAQ. And then the survey started, and as I said, when we reached a certain percentage after a week, we closed the survey and we helped identify who the influencers were in the organization.
Okay.
It's a tough question between, Daryl, this is a tough question between the need for sponsorship and the desire to actually produce some results quickly to drive buy-in and sponsorship. There's no instant answer. The best answer is that it depends on the element of the organization that you're working with. If it's a tactical group, if it's a cross-functional group, if it's a geographical group, versus are you transforming a whole organization? The bottom-up nature of this is also somewhat educational. Senior management likes results. It's better to have the site before you really engage them in it, rather than say, here's theoretically a way we can increase our effectiveness, reduce costs, and reduce friction in the organization. Because they'll often ask, wow, how? And you won't have a lot of topical evidence to provide them. So find a beachhead to land on is the best advice.
Okay, the questions keep coming. We still have 7 minutes. So Mike Pounsworth is asking, if influencers are channeled to communicate to others, should it not be transparent who they are? How ethical is it to keep who they are a secret?
Good question, but as I said before, you also don't want to have everyone approaching your influencers and say, by the way, I'm doing this small change program and you are in that area, can you help me? Yes, they might be able to, but they also may get so many requests that they don't have time to do it. And then they lose their ability to have time to network and maybe lose their influencer status because they are not out there being the trusted person that they were before. So it is something you need to really weigh and maybe have conversations with some of them before you do it.
I think the most important thing to recognize about influencers is from a comms perspective. Influencers are people you need to have be better informed than standard rank and file employees. At the very least, they need to be at least as well informed as management. What they do with this information can be influenced by what you ask of them or by what you don't ask of them. So to answer Michael's question, I don't think in providing influencers with access to a preferred information stream, especially if technically that stream is available to others who want it, something I call kind of passive transparency. You can register for it or ask about it and get it, but it's not going to be pushed to you if you're not necessarily an influencer. I don't see an ethical dimension in that. There may be an ethical dimension if you're engaging the influencer to actively drive messages into the organization. And those messages are showing up in one-to-one conversations. But even then, if the influencer agrees with and owns that message, there's certainly not an ethical issue. It's just that person is better informed and is taking a more active role in the company. That's my view, at least.
The next questions are something that I will be able to answer. Susan is asking an important question, as she says, that it has been simulating, and when is your next webinar? So it is on 21st of November at 6 p.m. CET. A little bit of change. We'll try the evening time slot, and you will get all the information, I think, next week. All the details we will be presenting via our board member in IABC EMENA will be presenting her gold quill. And then Amy Luddington is asking if the webinar is available on demand. Yes, everybody who registered will get the link to the recording tomorrow, so we can watch it again, or maybe watch it with your colleagues. And then Terry Mohidin, I'm really bad with names, I'm really sorry, is asking, there was a question about incentives. What chance to develop individually as a future leader be something to get potential influencers interested?
I think for someone to become an influencer, they have to have reached a rather elite level within the organization. When you're in the top 3%, I wouldn't say that being an influencer is a development opportunity per se. It is an opportunity to get visibility with leaders and senior management as a person of significance within the organization. And in an M&A situation, it's a really important, it could be very important to be recognized as an influencer, because you're then effectively recognized as somebody who it would be unwise to overboard in an M&A reorganization context. So there are plenty of incentives to participate, but I don't think it's something that you do to move up the ladder. It's kind of to move through the ladder.
I agree with Michael. Yeah.
If you want to add something, Michael.
No, I agree with Mike.
Okay. We have 2 minutes and 2 more questions that we will take. Natasha Deval is asking, do you recommend putting the influencers together or treat them as separate informal leaders who can help in their specific area?
Definitely put them together. Allow them to know who they are, because, as I said, there may be best practices, there may be success stories, there may be way they do things. And they may support each other and reach even further. So we've reached more than 90%. I definitely, it's always interesting to see who the influencers are once they are identified, and you will find that they are on different levels, as Mike had pointed out previously, on different levels in the organizations with different tenure, but that sort of the joint synopsis, DNA of them is that they are good at networking. They are out there, they're speaking to people, they are working with people, and as Mike also mentioned, they may have moved around the organization, so they know different parts of the business and the organization. But definitely give them a chance to work together.
I would be a little more cautious, actually, because it depends on what the initiative's about and what the what the scope is, and what the budget is. I mean, do you bring them to a kind of an influencers conference, physically get them to know each other? Do you put them all on an enterprise social network, or do you get groups, working groups or cross-functional groupings that are actually active within the business? I think it's a case-by-case basis.
Okay, and the last question from Amy Luddington. And what does this look like? Do we encourage the influencer to simply share, copy the message, or do we want them to tailor the message for their network? Would worry about them looking like a spam mouthpiece over time.
I think the willingness of the influencer to tailor, own, and share the organizational message in his or her own words is absolutely vital, even if
Yes.
they're critical.
Yeah, I think that the co-creation and helping to ensure that we use the right words and the right messages is a vital part of the success here.
Okay, let me now change the screen to come back to the Rock October. Michael and Mike, thank you so much for a very interesting webinar. I think we received a record number of questions, any webinar. So thank you once again for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us, and staying and being active in IABC.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And to everybody, again, thank you for being here. And please join us on the 21st of November. We will send you the details of our next webinar. And don't forget, you still have just a few hours left for our member month. And if you've been a member before and you want to renew now, this is a great time because you'll get 10% off of international dues. And if you haven't been a member, please join our family. I think we share a lot, we learn a lot, and we're a really active community of business communicators. So thank you everybody for joining us today, and we'll see and hear you next month on the 22nd, sorry, of November. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.